Hi, I'm Leary Sturdevant with the Star Tribune, and it's my very great privilege and pleasure to be able to moderate this morning's panel about the history of the DFL, the founding of the DFL that happened in 1944, and what the future might hold for progressive politics, particularly in Minnesota, which is my long suit. I first met Hubert Humphrey in 1964 at the National Corn Picking Contest near Brandon, South Dakota, and no, I wasn't there covering it. It only seems that way. I was 11 years old and I was in the tow of my grandfather, who was an old progressive. If he had been in Minnesota, he would have been in the farmer labor wing of the DFL party, and it was his pleasure to take his 11-year-old granddaughter by the hand and introduce her to the great Hubert Humphrey. Years later, I met Hubert Humphrey, and he told me he remembered that moment, which I really had to doubt, but he had the way of making people believe that he remembered them, and he did have this fabulous gift for remembering names, and he connected with me and lots of other people all through those years. Today we're going to talk a lot about what happened in the 1940s, running up to that merger. I want to introduce my distinguished panel. We have here on my immediate right, Berman, professor at the University of Minnesota, great expert, yes. Not only authority but a witness to a lot of political history in Minnesota and labor history in Minnesota through the 20th century and now into the 21st. Next to him is Sherman, whom you met from the previous panel. Norm was the press secretary to Hubert Humphrey during some of his most important contributing years to Minnesota and American politics. Glad to have you on our panel, Norm, with your great stories. Then, on my far left, your right, is DJ Leary, who was also witness to some of those same period in Humphrey's career, went on to found politics in Minnesota and remain a close observer of Minnesota politics. And then, yes. And then bringing us into the present, and I hope the future, is Tom Horner, the titular head of the Independence Party, longtime public affairs executive, the candidate for governor of the Independence Party in Minnesota in 2010. Great panel. Friends, I remember my first convention actually covering Hubert Humphrey happened to be Humphrey's last convention. It was 1976, the DFL convention, and there was quite a disruption there with concerned laborers, miners, members of the United Mine Workers who were unhappy with restrictions on taconite tailings associated with a reserve mining controversy. And into that fray, with demonstrators outside the arena and an unhappy crowd in the balcony in the arena, in came Hubert Humphrey, dressed, as I recall, in sort of an all-white or very light-colored suit, so that when the spotlight fell on him, he sort of glowed. And he spoke to those unhappy and worried delegates, kind of like a father would, to reassure the family. We're with you. We're still on your side. Everything's going to be all right, was essentially his message. And I was told by the old-timers at the press table, I was the kid at the table that day, oh, this is the father of the DFL, the guy who engineered the merger in 1944, speaking to the children and saying, don't worry, that we're still with you. But was I told correctly that day, Berman? Was he really the engineer of that merger? You come up here and tell us the story.
One of the problems about sitting up here is that we don't hear the speaker. So I may have to turn to my fellow panelists and talk to them directly, so excuse me. Now, what I told Leary last night is that I may be raining on this parade. The reason I may be raining on this parade is because, as a historian, I have to tell it as I see it. And as I see it, it's how my graduate students saw it in their research. And their research on the founding of the DFL is quite different than the conventional wisdom. Hubert Humphrey was 32 years old when the DFL was formed. I don't know too many 32-year-olds that play a critical leading role in any political movement. He was also then a graduate student. He was a failed candidate for mayor of Minneapolis. Now, don't get me wrong. He played a role in the merger. It was a minor role, but a significant one. He was secretary of the Unity Convention, and as such, played a significant role. But the merger of the Farmer Labor Party and the Democratic Party is more interesting than what we know in conventional wisdom. The architects of the merger were in fact not Minnesotans at all. The architects of the merger were in Washington and in New York. In Washington, the White House. In New York, 12th Street. Those of you who don't know what the designation of 12th Street, let me tell you, it was the headquarters of the American Communist Party. It was an architectural combination that found its way in Minnesota through Washington and New York. What's the reason? Well, very simply, the White House was concerned about the electoral votes from Minnesota. The Republican comeback after 1938 had reached a point where the White House political people were concerned that Roosevelt's fourth re-election term, or fourth election term, third re-election term, would be in jeopardy if Minnesota's electoral votes don't come in the right place. They felt that the way this could be accomplished would be to unify the Farmer Labor Party and the Democratic Party. Remember that the Democratic Party in Minnesota at that time was essentially a patronage party, a party that consisted largely of mainly Catholic constituents in St. Paul and St. Cloud, the two saints. And the Farmer Labor Party then was a party that was really dominated by the Popular Front. For those of you who don't know the term Popular Front, the Popular Front was a coalition of forces that were to the left of center and were primarily forces that were allied with the American Communist Party. Now, the communists come into this very simply. The fear that Roosevelt's defeat in '44 would jeopardize the war effort. And in 1943-44, the communists were even more patriotic than any American. Of course, their concern was, of course, the security of the Soviet Union. And then, therefore, in Washington and in New York, there was this joint feeling that Minnesota needed a single progressive party that would, in fact, guarantee that Roosevelt would be reelected in 1944. This was the motivation. Oscar Ewing, the Secretary of Commerce, practically lived in the state through 1943 because the two real architects of the merger in Minnesota, the two reluctant Elmers, I call them, had to be convinced. Elmer Kelm, the Democratic Party chair, and Elmer Benson, the party chair of the Farmer Labor Party. Both of them believed that a merger would be the death knell for both parties. Elmer Kelm's Democratic Party would die, and Farmer Labor Party with a Popular Front outlook would die. And both were right. The merger did kill both of these parties and created a new party. So Elmer Kelm and Elmer Benson had to be convinced. Elmer Kelm was convinced very simply by Oscar Ewing, who said to him, in effect, your patronage is going to be cut off completely if you don't cooperate. Elmer Benson's reluctance was overcome when he was told by the communist leaders that their support for him as chair of the Farmer Labor Party would come to an end. Despite that, there was, of course, struggles and difficulties, but the architect of the Farmer Labor Party and the Democratic Party were, in fact, not Minnesotans at all. That's the story. Hubert Humphrey was actively involved in the merger activities, but he was actively involved on the fringes, not in the center. And as being actively involved in the fringes, he certainly was, of course, a leading figure in the public activities leading to the merger. Now, of course, we move from that to other questions that we'll be discussing. Is merger possible today? Well, we don't have the equivalent of White House pressure, nor do we have the equivalent of New York pressure. But we have other pressures. The pressures of, in fact, making sure that we have a progressive government in Minnesota, one that meets the needs of the people in the same way that the Democratic Farmer Labor Party attempted to meet the needs of the people in the past. I'll leave that question up to the rest of my panelists.
Well, we're not just going to ask for questions from or answers from the rest of the panelists, but also from our audience. I hope to allow enough time at the end of this conversation to invite questions from this group as well. So be thinking about what you'd like to ask as you listen to these good speakers. Norm and DJ, in that order, I'm going to call you up next, and I realize that we're auditorially challenged here. But I wonder if by the time you come into this story of Hubert Humphrey, which is 20 to 25 years on after the DFL merger, whether there was still a visible seam between the old Farmer Labor Party and the old Democratic Party in Minnesota, and whether Hubert was still actively trying to knit that together, or was this a merger that was so well designed and well engineered from on high that it gelled beautifully, and we were almost immediately on to other kinds of concerns. Norm, tell us about that, and tell us about when you got involved in Hubert's story.
This is a challenge beyond me. I don't know the answer to your question. I think that from inside the Humphrey office, you dealt with the state as though it were the Democratic Party was a single force. But the farmer labor folks a lot of them were never comfortable with Humphrey. They thought of him as kind of a centrist, maybe even beyond, and were difficult to deal with. Humphrey was an extraordinary man. Every voice that came to him was fresh, new, and he was accepting of it. For the rest of us on the staff, it was difficult sometimes. You had people, I think of them from Thief River Falls and north, who were very tough on us, and it was difficult. I really don't know exactly, but I want to take advantage of you and you, because I got a couple of stories left over from this morning that I didn't use. I went with Mr. Humphrey I used to advance the trips, as I said earlier, overseas, but we had a visit to the Rome Opera, and this was during the Vietnam War, and we arrived at the Rome Opera, Humphrey with the ambassador's wife, and a young teenage girl. And as we got out of the limousine, a bag of paint, plastic bag of paint, was thrown from back someplace across and hit the wall behind Humphrey and the impresario of the opera, who was a tall, large guy with hanging chins, and the paint splashed. And it was dramatic. Another agent leapt over a car, grabbed the guy who threw the plane, was beating him up. It was chaos. I was trying to keep photographers from getting a picture. My work as a press secretary was to avoid bad press, so I did that. But there was a Secret Service agent who was a miserable human being and never smiled, and I went into the opera lobby and he was doubled over with laughter. And I couldn't believe it. I said, "What happened?" He said, "I just overheard Humphrey say to the impresario of the opera, who was covered with paint, Humphrey said, 'Does this happen to you often?'" And the guy said, "Not in 30 years. I later asked Humphrey, I said, "For God's sakes, what were you thinking?" He said, "I was just reaching for something to make the guy feel good." And so I can't answer your question, but I can tell you about Humphrey in the opera. I also want to tell you about Humphrey with a luncheon with de Gaulle. It was very select. It was so select I didn't get invited, but we were on the trip, and as Humphrey went to the luncheon, he picked up a toast that the State Department had prepared for him and read it and decided it was truly awful. So he ad-libbed praise for de Gaulle, for the French, the American Revolution, back to the thing. And you think of de Gaulle as this austere person. Humphrey reduced him to tears. That tells you how effective Humphrey could be in all kinds of difficult situations. But de Gaulle shed a tear when Humphrey spoke. So it's one of the cherished moments. I got one other story I'm going to tell, whether you like it or not. In 1955, Harry Truman came to the old Prom Ballroom to speak at a DFL fundraiser, a Jefferson Jackson Day dinner, I think, and I was very important. I mean, I was taller then, and I was told by Bill Kubitschek that I was to sit at the press table down below and was to signal Truman. Television was new. We had a half-hour television show we'd bought, and they cut them off right at the edge. In any case, Kubitschek said, "You stand down there and you give Truman 3 minutes, 2 minutes, 1 minute, half a minute, cut." And I went up and said, "Mr. President, I'm going to be sitting in that empty seat down there, and I'm feeling very important. I mean, who the hell gets to give orders to an ex-president of the United States? I am very important." And I explained to Truman what I'm going to do, 3, 2, 1. And, oh, he says, "Yes, no," and he reviewed it with me. "Now, you're going to be sitting right there." "Yes, sir." 3 minutes. "Yes, sir." And he was putting me on, and I didn't realize it till they tell me 3 minutes, and I give them the signal, 2 minutes, 1 minute, half a minute, like this, and he smiles, and he goes on for another 10 minutes. I like to think of that as the most powerful moment of my life. And
Norman, we should have devoted an entire panel just to your stories. I think they're marvelous. DJ, you were in Minnesota during more of those years, those 60s and 70s years, and I'm wondering if you were conscious that the divide that emerged over the Vietnam War within the DFL, was that, in your view, in some ways a relic, a remnant of the old divide prior to the Farmer Labor and Democratic Party merger? Was there any, is there a sense in which that divide was still with us, or had that really been sealed over and we were now on to something else 25 years on? What are your thoughts about that?
Laurie, it's good of you to add class to this gathering. Your questions are much better than the answers. But as Norman has shown you, we never gave a damn about the questions anyway, so it doesn't matter. Norman Sherman has been my friend for 60 years, and we've been kind of the Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn of the Humphrey operation. And anything you hear about us, lewd, lascivious, terrible, it's probably true. In fact, it's probably been cleaned up. The people who came from what was known as the progressive left, 66, 68, in the Minnesota DFL, did not come out of the farmer labor group. They were new. That 66 convention where they endorsed Sandy Keith over Karl Rolvag, I went to the convention. God, I was in that hotel long enough to run for public office, and you seldom saw anybody you knew, and they were delegates. So it was a real forecast of what was to come. 2 years later, many of you were here this morning and heard a marvelous and inspirational message from my old friend Tom Tipton. Let me tell you a piece, one piece. Tom Tipton is best known, as Norm and I will never be, as one who talks to God, and God apparently listens. Well, that's right. It depends on if the children of Israel are asking for something, I have them talk. But we were doing the presidential primary 1972 in Florida. George Wallace was in that campaign. And about 600 or 700 guys named Sam. Longest ballot I'd seen in a long time. And Tom needed to do an ad that spoke to the African American community, to black people, then really centered around the churches. And he did this magnificent ad. I don't know if you still have a copy of it, but it was a full-page picture of Humphrey. And it had the lines on it, "You know this man. He is our friend, and he needs your help." That was it. Terrific vote in the black community in that particular time. Norman had mentioned Kennedy. Somebody talked about Teddy Kennedy when I was out in Washington shortly before he died. And they said, you know, Kennedy learned so much from Humphrey. And I'd never heard it put like that. And so I inquired really how that was. Well, first of all, let me tell you that Hubert Humphrey said to me one time, talking about Jack Kennedy, I mean, this exact words, he said, "God, DJ, how I loved that man." He said, "I can't tell you, and that was a pretty good fight they had in West Virginia." He told me about going to see the Cardinal, Richard Cardinal Cushing in Boston, which was kind of the hometown priest of the Kennedy family, sent straight from the Vatican. And he was stooped and bent at that age, and as we walked in, Humphrey began to sit in a chair, and he said, he had what we used to call, in our circles, a whiskey voice, but I'm sure he had a different way. And he said, "Oh, Hubert, sit over here in this chair. This is the chair Joe Kennedy sat in the night we decided how much to pay those Baptist preachers to talk against you in West Virginia." But Teddy Kennedy, what he got from Hubert Humphrey, and it becomes so clear when you think about it, Teddy was always happy with half a loaf or a quarter of a loaf. He'd get enough pieces out that he knew that down here you could add more. And that's the way Humphrey would build things. You know, he goes there in 1949 and he talks about this goofy thing about Medicare. But he keeps talking about it, and he talks to the president about it, and he talks about it, and he talks about it for 20 years. And here we are today, of course, trying to save it. And anybody that's been any part, it's one of the great programs that works marvelously in this thing. But that's what we missed in Teddy Kennedy, that he watched and learned from Hubert Humphrey. Let me tell you one other thing. I told somebody this about a week ago, and I hadn't thought about it in a long time. Norman and I were struck by lightning to have been so lucky to be in the embrace, the friendship embrace of this wonderful man. We can tell you stories from now until hell freezes over and you will enjoy them, but I'll tell you, we learned about the deep soul that drove this man's decisions in everything. Somebody asked me last year, gee, I don't know, election year, you know, if I can vote for Mark Dayton. I said, you know, I've known Mark for 30 years. You vote for him, and I'll give you my personal guarantee. You might not agree with him on exactly where he is, but he'll do what's right. A good person, and that's kind of the confidence, you know. Thank you. You know, Mark is not exactly what you'd call Mr. Warmth on television, and does not come across. Or Mr. Relaxation, but anyway, the thing is that Humphrey, you know, came across as the guy next door, what have you. But when we would travel around thousands of miles and endless days, and that he would tell us things. It's like the HHH. Many of you have some buttons on. And one time, I gave him a poster that we just done up for a campaign, and it said something spectacular like HHH something. And he looks at it and he says, not this one. And he usually didn't throw my stuff away quite so fast, but anyway, I said, what is it? I find out that HHH. He says, that's some headline writer in the East. Nobody out here calls me HHH. I'm Humphrey. It's like Campbell's on soup. We didn't forget it, did we? I mean, that's just exactly the way it was. And I'll tell you another thing. As close as we were blessed to be, it also got you late night phone calls, but as close to this day, you will never have heard Norman or myself ever having referred to him as Hubert. Guys in bib overalls down in Martin County, Hubert, you know, like they were just at the Grange meeting with him or something. We feel a little bristle go up the back of our neck. But we never felt that kind of familiarity. We always had raised him up in our minds, in ourselves, in our hearts, that he was better than a first name basis. We'll talk more.
Thank you, DJ, for reminding us and lifting up Hubert Humphrey, the compromiser. Interesting moment in Minnesota state politics for lifting that up. I'm impressed with the extent to which this national and international figure stayed connected to Minnesota, and how automatic but not quite it was for him to come back in 1970 and run again for the Senate and reclaim that Senate seat, and do so with a fair amount of adroitness. And you told me a little bit about that last night, and we can talk about the 1970 campaign with this panel if you care to. Norm, I don't know if you were still involved with Humphrey in 1970, but there are some interesting stories about Humphrey's return to Minnesota and reclaiming of that mantle of the leader of the party at a time when the party was divided, very much divided. But Humphrey was able to bridge those divisions again, just as he had done. What Humphrey did back in 1944, as a 32-year-old, and I'll put in with you, I think that merger was really engineered in bigger places farther away. But Humphrey had provided fresh evidence that there was a problem politically with having a divided Democratic and Farmer Labor Party. He had run for mayor of this city, in this city hall, in 1943 as a Democrat, and had lost. And the thought was, if he had had more support, more of the mantle of the Farmer Labor Party, as well as the Democratic Party, he might have won. So there was fresh evidence that there was a political problem with having the progressive wing of Minnesota politics divided. Some would say that we have had that kind of evidence in modern times. And that brings me to Tom Horner. We have, again, in Minnesota today, and have had now since the success of Jesse Ventura into the reformed then Independence Party governor in 1998, we have had, you could argue, two progressive parties again. And we've had, again, evidence that having two progressive parties doesn't always work out well for the progressive side. So, Tom Horner, what about that? and what's might another merger make sense on in the progressive wing?
Well, thank you, and thanks to Leary. When Leary introduced me and connected me to Jesse Ventura, DJ leaned over and said, "Lucky you." So let me tell you one story from last year. I was fortunate enough to have 3 ex-governors endorse me, each of them in their own way. So Arne Carlson, who still very much appreciates all the trappings of politics. We went around in a bus, great rallies, terrific hoopla, press conferences in communities around the state. It was terrific. Al Quee, who is doing another panel in this building, in typical fashion, he and I were at the Capitol late in the campaign doing a press conference on judicial reform, an issue that only Al Quee, Tom Horner, and about 5 other people care about in the state. And in the middle of the press conference, Al interrupts and says, "You know, I'm going to endorse Tom Horner." Jesse Ventura endorsed me on Geraldo Rivera. And I had to promise my wife it was the first and last time my name ever would be mentioned on Geraldo Rivera's program. And actually, I was supposed to be on a panel with Governor Quee. Leary invited me to join this one, and I very much was delighted to do it, particularly when I looked at my fellow panelists. To be on this panel with such distinguished gentlemen and Leary, knowing that I would hear great stories. And I'm going to be honest with you, there are fewer and fewer panels these days when I get to be the kid. So I'm delighted. But I want to stop short, given what's happening over at Target Field these days, of using a baseball metaphor and calling me a pinch hitter, because there's the fear now that I'll walk away and somebody will say, "You know, if only he had been a little bit better, he could have been the next Jason Repko." So let me talk about the question that Leary posed, and a little bit about what is the future of the parties of progressive politics, of conservative politics for that matter. And I think there is a lot of evidence that when you look at the two largest parties, the DFL and the Republican Party, both of them in their own ways are in a period of decline. I think it's most immediately apparent in the Republican Party. And I think, in fact, you know, the Republican Party, whatever you think of Chair Tony Sutton, he's doing all the right things politically. I mean, when he has an agenda that becomes increasingly narrow, he has to drive polarization. He has to drive purity. He has to drive people out of the party. And so when he talks to the folks, the Republicans who endorsed me and says, they're quislings, they're out of the party, we don't need them anymore. Horrible civic discourse, horrible in terms of public policy, but hard to argue with the politics, as unfortunate as that might be. You know, and I think you can look at 3 reasons why political parties are in this state of transition and maybe in a state of decline. First and foremost, young voters. I mean, where do young voters affiliate? And increasingly, they affiliate around what's important to them, around issues, around their own opportunity, and less around organizations. That's true of a lot of organizations, not just the political parties, but becomes very, very critical for the political parties. I mean, they don't have that base of young voters who are absolutely committed, come hell or high water, on the issue. Secondly, we've seen in Minnesota for a long time, and really saw it in spades this past election, how comfortable Minnesotans are in voting for individuals, not for political parties, in what in political parlance is called ticket splitters. You know, Minnesotans are very, very comfortable in going down the ballot to say, like this person, not so much this person, like this person, with less regard for their political party affiliation and much more regard for who it is. I mean, people say, boy, how unusual that we would elect a Democratic governor and in a historic outcome, elect Republican majorities in both the state House and the state Senate. Not really. I mean, I think in all of those elections, Minnesotans were sending a lot of the same message, not about tax the rich or government living within its means, but about government doing something, government getting something done, government being more responsive, government taking action. And the third issue, and I think one that is really significant, is that increasingly the platforms of political parties are formed and shaped less by grassroots opinion and much more by the influence of money. And that's problematic. It's problematic not just for the future of the political parties, but I think it's problematic for the future of what we want to be as a state. And we're going to see more and more influence of money. You know, easy to say that when you look at what happened in the legislative elections last year, that it was a response to the Tea Party, it was a response to a perception that government's out of control. But look at race after race and how much money influenced the outcome of a lot of those legislative races. And so in the midst of all of this, we have the Independence Party. And the Independence Party, I think, is a reflection of a lot of people's dissatisfaction with the Democratic and Republican parties. To be sure, an imperfect vehicle. To be sure, maybe not even a good vehicle, much less the best vehicle. But nonetheless, very much a reflection of how dissatisfied people are with parties that they perceive to be moving farther to the right and farther to the left when a lot of us are right here. I mean, look at poll after poll after poll. And more than that, talk to your peers, talk to your colleagues. You know, what they all say is, no, we could get there. We could do some of this, we could do some of that. And yet the political parties, the Democrat and Republican parties, keep pushing us out here and here. The Independence Party, I think, reflects a dissatisfaction that goes much deeper than the vote totals that show up every 2 or 4 years. I think it reflects a fundamental dissatisfaction with what the Democratic and Republican parties are reflecting. And I think, you know, when you talk about the future of progressive politics, when you talk about the future of conservative politics, I believe it is the Independence Party voters who are in play. I believe it is those voters who can help define where Minnesota goes if one of the parties, the other parties, is willing to reach out and embrace those voters in meaningful ways. But they also have to think differently about how they approach issues, because they have to think about my daughter. So let me give you one anecdote. I have 3 kids, and I have to say, I think I'm the only one who can stand up here and say with absolute certainty and with direct lineage, I owe my kids to Hubert Humphrey and to Dave Dernberger. My wife worked for Hubert Humphrey and then for Muriel Humphrey. I worked for Dave Dernberger when he was first elected in 1978. The first person I met in Washington was Libby, with whom I'll celebrate my 31st wedding anniversary this year. So thank you, Hubert Humphrey, and thank you, Dave Dernberger. But let me tell you just quickly about my 3 kids. Oldest one graduates from high school in 2002. He gets a message from his university that says, here's your dorm room, here's your roommate, here's his parents' landline phone number, good luck, we'll see you in September. Second one graduates in 2004. He gets a message from his university that says, here's your dorm room, here's your roommate, here's his cell phone number, call, and if it's really not going to work out, maybe we'll try to do something differently. My daughter graduates in 2007. She gets a message from her university that says, here's the website you go to, and on that website are all the dorm rooms on our campus. And you can click on, see if anyone is open, explore which dorm you want to live in, see if there's somebody already assigned. If there is, what does she do? Goes to Facebook, of course, and finds out information. Each of the 3 kids ends up in university housing. The university's need is solved, my children's needs are solved. But from beginning to end, my daughter owned that decision. She had all of the information. She had everything she needed to make a decision that worked for her. And you know what really stands out? I'm flabbergasted by this, and she thinks nothing of it. Well, of course, Dad, that's how you always make decisions. You know? That's where I think our political processes have to go, is to move from this voice of authority, here's the problem, here's the solution, let's get in lockstep, to a voice of understanding that says, we share a challenge. Let's figure out what our collective solution is. That's the opportunity, I think, for political parties. If we move away from a fight over the status quo, if we move away from arguing whether, as we're doing today in Minnesota, should the status quo be smaller or should the status quo be larger? When you look at the future, when you look at all of the kids that are coming into the political process today, for whom they've always controlled information around how to make decisions, the status quo isn't going to work. It's irrelevant. They want new solutions. And so, my final comment, when you think about the future of politics in Minnesota, politics in everything that is good about politics, how we collectively make decisions, how we come together as a community to figure out what kind of a state do we want to live in, I think that future is going to belong to those organizations, and maybe they won't even be political parties, those organizations that figure out how to engage people around the question that really matters: what kind of a state do we want to live in? And what are we as individuals willing to do to achieve that kind of state? It is such a great honor to be up here with these distinguished people and with you in the audience. Thank you very much.
So it's time to think about asking this panel some questions, but I get the first one because I'm already up here at the microphone. And I may ask you either to come up to the microphone if you care to, or if not, really plan on having a really big voice, because we are, as I said, acoustically challenged here today. Tom, your remarks make me think that what you are saying is that organizational merger on the progressive side might have made very good sense at an earlier era. Obviously did, history suggests, did make very good sense in 1944, and may be unnecessary and irrelevant going forward now. But we have other mechanisms that could produce a progressive majority vote. And one of those mechanisms has been much discussed in Minnesota. That's instant runoff voting, or ranked choice voting, which will cause folks who maybe haven't been in Minnesota and party to this debate to scratch their heads. But it's the notion that instead of checking off on a multi-candidate ballot, instead of checking off the one candidate that you would like to vote for, you had on a multi-candidate ballot can vote 1, 2, 3. If you lived in city Minneapolis, you did that in the last city election in 2009. That possibility is something that other folks have thought about. And I'll ask first maybe Tom, because he can help me explain ranked choice voting, and he's been party to that conversation, why it is that the Independence Party and the DFL Party now are in support of that notion, and then maybe ask Kai a little bit to put in historical perspective after Tom speaks. Then we'll open it up to questions. Go ahead.
Well, thank you. So Laurie actually gave a pretty good description of ranked choice voting. Minneapolis is using it. Some other communities are using it. And it just simply allows your vote to matter regardless of who you want to vote for. Even if you think that, boy, that independence candidate for governor really would have been a good governor, but I just don't think he can win, it allows you to vote for that candidate, and your vote still matters, because you can rank the candidates. You can vote for your first choice, your second choice, and then the votes continue to be recalculated until you get a majority winner. I think that ranked choice voting as part of a larger political reform is really important to the future of Minnesota. If we could combine it with some changes in how we define legislative districts, congressional districts, make those districts more competitive, and if we could manage better how we shape the influence of money in politics, I think those three changes would really open the door to much more robust conversation about what kind of a state we do want to live in, and really open the door to new ideas, to new ways of thinking. Because I do think that as Laurie alluded to, the future, I mean, there may be mergers, there may be affiliations. I don't think that the affiliations are going to be organizational as much as they're going to be ideological. I think it is going to be people, voters, coming together in different election years around candidates who reflect a vision of the future that meets that need at that time, whatever label they happen to carry.
Hi, let me invite you to the microphone and ask you to comment about the long historical trend with regard to parties. Are parties waning in their influence, and where are we headed with parties?
It's a very difficult question to answer historically, because parties have always been in transition. Historically, there's never been a time when there's been a kind of set in stone kind of relationship of parties. Even in 43, 44, the merger of the Farmer Labor Party with the Democratic Party was in fact ideologically driven, as I tried to point out. It was politically and ideologically driven. And of course, the fact that there were competing ideologies within one party meant in fact that there's going to be a split, as there was in 47 and 48. And that split was irrevocable and came back again in 68. I mean, the same folks that were in the Henry Wallace movement in 48 were in the Gene McCarthy movement in 68. That split was there. It's always there. Now, the point that Tom made about making political movements more accessible to everyone, I think that's the issue. And I think, yes, some form of better assessing what people want and need is needed. The multiple voting is one. Proportional representation is another. Of course, again, historically, proportional representation led to some problems. In New York City, where it was in effect in the 1930s and 40s, you had 3 communists elected to the city council. That didn't, sit well with many folks. So there were problems. But I think we have ways of getting around these problems, of finding solutions. Some Tom has alluded to. I served on a commission that Joan Grow, in fact, formed back in who knows when, where we came up. Well, I'm a historian. I don't remember dates. Particularly in events that I participated in. But we came up with what I thought was a wonderful kind of compromise solution on fixing at least some of the obvious ills in our Minnesota system. And it was signed off by all political parties and agreed to by all. But it was blocked in the House of Representatives by the Speaker, who got his orders from one institution, and that was the MCCL. He got his orders from them, and he refused to bring it up for a vote. As a consequence, it failed. Well, we have to find a way to prevent one person from blocking the will of all of us. And I don't know how we could do that. Merger today is not, of course, possible. No, first of all, there is no such thing as an independence party. There are independent candidates, like Tom. There's no party there. Jesse Ventura could have built a party, but he didn't. He chose not to. There is no party there. The Republican Party is I think, excluding everyone else out and therefore becoming a narrow kind of a party. And that goes contrary to our definition of parties in the American system, which is the broad tent, the all-inclusive party. The DFL party is divisive within itself, to be sure. It always has been, and probably always will be. There are factions within factions. There are, some groups who feel that they're more exploited than others, and therefore they need more attention. But that's the case. So we have to find a way of resolving all of these issues, and it takes, I think, more intelligent people than the 5 of us sitting up here to do that. It takes all of us, I think, to do that. Merger, I think, is not the issue. The issue is finding a way to make our political system meaningful to the needs of most of our people. And the Republicans aren't doing it. In fact, Republicans, well, they've moved to the point where they believe that government has no role whatsoever in our society, where they believe, in fact, government should be drowned in a bathtub. And that's not what political parties were meant to do. In the development of our political party system, historically, political parties always existed to meet certain needs of the society. And the Republican Party is out to meet the needs of only a very small segment of the society, the very wealthy. Well, that's not a party. The Democratic Farmer Labor Party is riven with factionalism. That's not a party. So consequently, we have a problem.
Consequently, we have a problem. I promised to get this good audience involved in this conversation, and I see a hand already here in the front row. Could you stand up or maybe even come up and help us with the question, because we're so troubled here with bad acoustics. Thank you. I'm going to repeat the question because I understand that folks are having trouble hearing. The question is it really accurate that we have the parties, one party going farther and farther to the left, the other party going farther and farther to the right? In fact, have not both parties, since 1980, the dawn of the Ronald Reagan era, have not both parties moved to the right, and have not progressive folks had a harder and harder time finding a political party and candidates that satisfy their interests and their desires? Do you take that as a point well taken, Tom?
In general terms, yes, I do. I mean, I think there's no question, at least in my mind, that the Republican Party has galloped to the right and continues to do that regardless of where the cliff is. And I think the Democratic Party has taken steps to move to the right. But I think you have to define it in the context not of history, but where the public is. And I'd argue that when you look at the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, in terms of where most people are, that the platform of the Democratic Party is more to the left than where most people are, and the platform of the Republican Party certainly is much farther to the right. So in the context of where voters are, I think you have that divide.
Yeah. Question over here, Tom Tipton, yes. Tom's question. Tom's question is about the National Convention in Chicago, and I think you mean the 1968 convention. The George McGovern convention was in Miami. If you're talking about the Chicago convention, that's 1968. And your question about the 68 conventions. Yes, was the action of the police in Chicago and of the Mayor Daley, how did that affect Humphrey's chances that year, and how did Hubert Humphrey respond to that, given his desire to have a united party? Norm, why don't you start with that?
I have no response. I don't know. Mayor Daley was more than difficult, but ultimately I'm not sure what difference it made to us. I mean, Humphrey came back from the pits. I really can't answer it. I haven't thought about it in a long time, and I can't make sense. DJ may have something more.
I don't think it certainly didn't have any effect on their personal relationship. There's a short time period in between when this happened, and Ed Muskie came to see Hubert Humphrey because he asked him to be vice presidential candidate, and he wanted to talk to him, and Muskie said, "I've got to tell you, I've got an unmarried daughter who's pregnant." And Humphrey thought for a second about it. He says, "Well, I don't think it'll matter, but let's call Dick Daley and ask him." And Daley answered the phone and he says, "Doesn't make a damn bit of difference," and then hung up. So even after that little bit, Humphrey would turn to the guy who was a master politician. I think the best mayor of Chicago retired last week. Best ever been.
Stay put. I want to ask you a question. Stay put. I want to ask DJ a question. Did you have the impression that, and perhaps because of his Minnesota experiences in the 1940s, Hubert Humphrey was more concerned about party unity than your average run-of-the-mill politician whom we know have great propensity to falling into factionalism and all kinds of disputes. Was he particularly concerned about holding the family together?
No.
No.
Humphrey learned very early on and used to repeat it to us, you can't run the DFL party from Washington. Every few years when somebody would want to run to be chairman from his staff, we go through those ups and downs of the thing, and they would not do very well, would not stay in for the time, and then he just repeated again, you cannot run the DFL party from Washington, D.C.
Okay. I'm seeing lots of hands here. Lots of hands, so let's get some more folks in the conversation. Yes, hi. I'm seeing some heads nod, and let me just tell you, as a journalist, one of the reasons that the word progressive is in vogue is the word liberalism now has a stigma. That is, we try to use words that aren't so stigmatized and so progressive, and it's also sort of a mushy word. I think I know of, and we had with us last night in the presence of a person of a couple of former Minnesota governors, there are progressive Republicans, people who still identify as Republicans, who are progressives. There are some in this state still, but help me out, Hi, with the definition of progressive.
I'll try to answer that historically. To be a progressive and have progressive politics means, in effect, the belief that there is a role to be played by the society at large, that is government, in resolving the social, economic problems of people in that society. I think that's the definition of progressive. The details depend on the specifics of the particular problem, and you spelled out some of the details, but the general philosophy is that there is a role to play by us collectively as government in the resolution of our social and economic problems, period. That's it. Oh, by the way, while I'm here in the microphone, everybody told stories. I didn't tell any stories. I want to tell a couple of stories. My relationship with Hubert Humphrey has to do with after he was defeated for the presidency of the United States. When he came back to Minnesota and was a joint appointment at McAllister at the University of Minnesota. People forget that he was at the University of Minnesota. I was his chairman for 2.5 years. And when he first came to the university and we were setting up an office for him, I asked Norman, what kind of furnishings should we put into that office? And Norman said, with a straight face, South Dakota Renaissance. And we fitted it that way with second-hand furnishings. And he loved it. Second story. As titular head of the Democratic Party during the time that he was teaching at the University of Minnesota, he was called upon to go around the country. Obviously, that was his job. But his also job was to be in the classroom. He never missed a class. Or if he had to miss a class, he had someone substitute for him. And through my office, those 2 years, came the best and the brightest of the political figures in the country. Yes, even people from the Republican Party. To my surprise, one day, into my office walks Barry Goldwater. What are you doing here? Oh, I'm taking Hubert's class today. Can you imagine that? Unannounced, unheralded. There he was. And people like that came through periodically. Hubert, of course, did not come to the University of Minnesota with what I was going to say good credentials among the students. In fact, one of the issues was that his office was a corner office, and he had some Secret Service protection at the time, and they were concerned about that. It was on the second floor, if he were cornered. And I went to the local hardware store and bought a rope ladder. And I brought it in, and I went to the Secret Service, is this okay? They said, oh, that'll do. That'll do. But the point is, he came with the sharp anti-war sentiment among the student body, and he, of course, was a target of it. And he was concerned about it, as I was as well. But it turned out that concern was not necessary. He walked into the classroom, there was initial hostility. But after 5 minutes, there was a warmth, a kind of glow of warmth in the classroom that I've never seen before and haven't seen since.
Thank you, Hy. Those are good stories. Thank you. I still see several hands, and so I'm going to ask this audience's indulgence to go a few minutes over, and I'll start with Nancy Kleeman in the back. Already covered. Very good. Judge Howard.
Professor Berman, how did Orville Freeman and Hubert Humphrey kick the communists out of the party and not have a split, and the Democratic Party then continued on to its renaissance? How did they engineer a takeover without causing two parties to break apart?
For everyone's benefit, the question is, how did they manage to engineer the merger in 1944 without causing such a rift among the socialist and communist side of the Farmer Labor Party that it fell apart? I have to tell you, the last interview that Elmer Benson ever gave was to me, I'm proud to say, in 1983, just a few weeks before he died. He was still, to that day, extremely angry with Hubert Humphrey for what had happened to him. So,
yes. That's a very good question, and if we had another hour, an hour and a half, I could give you the details on that. But basically, let me quickly say that to those who believe that there was a purge of the left-wing communist forces in 1947-48 are mistaken, because there wasn't a purge. If there was a purge, it was a self-purge, because the tactics of the left in the DFL was, of course, to back Henry Wallace for the presidency of the United States. The strategy in Minnesota of the DFL Popular Fronters was to capture the DFL for Henry Wallace's candidacy. In the midst of their efforts, they received orders from New York. Stop it. You're going into the Progressive Party, not into the Democratic Party. They moved themselves out of the DFL party. There was no need for a purge. So the belief that there was a purge came after the fact, probably after there was resistance on allowing them back in. But the fact of the matter is that there was no purge. They excluded themselves. They refused to continue with the county conventions in, Hennepin County, Ramsey County, and St. Louis County conventions, the three major ones. They refused to continue the fight into those conventions and pulled out and formed the Progressive Party of Minnesota.
Go ahead.
I have a little bit of irrelevancy here. I discovered recently that Fritz Mondale and I were both at the Henry Wallace rally in 1948. We reacted. It was a deplorable, it was an awful moment. There were times that they turned out all the lights, and there were two entrances at the head table. They shined a spotlight on one entrance and announced that Wallace was coming in, he came in on the dark side, and he tripped, and it was the goddamnedest thing you ever saw. It was just awful. In any case, what is interesting to me is that Mondale moved back into the DFL as a result of the Wallace thing. It was such a deplorable, badly done thing. I went to the left, but to the Trotskyists, as a matter of fact. But that the party was really, it was a time of great, great tension and reaction to this stuff. And anyway, Mondale and I got together again 20 years later.
Okay, great. We're over time. I'll take one more question. I think I saw one more hand over here. Yes, sir.
That's Jules Goldstein, and I currently serve as the historian of the state DFL party.
Oh, wonderful.
And I just want to reduce the founding of the party down to one Elderman's quote,
Okay.
which is, Humphrey's a fascist, Kelm is a fascist, but merge we must.
The quote, Humphrey's the fascist, Kelm is a fascist, but merge we must. The imperative to act is something that Minnesotans are going to be discussing, I think, a lot of the next few weeks at the state capitol. And I think this conversation is actually, it puts a great big historical backdrop on what we're seeing today in Minnesota politics. Thanks everybody for coming. Thank you, panel. Have a good rest of your day.